Hey,
Hey,
welcome to the CoCreativeSex Summit Podcast series, Hasina.
I'm glad to be here.
Thank you for coming on. Hasina is actually a very special guest because I got to know her very well over my process of writing Sex Up Your Life. And I got the chance of interviewing all these amazing people, and Hasina was one of those people. And what I thought was extraordinary with her story was how much depth and like reflection she had about this topic. So she's going to really be an amazing eye opener and sort of like really a sense of like what's the process you have to follow when you're in a situation where maybe it's your family, maybe it's your culture, maybe it's your religion, but basically who you are on a sexual identity is not understood or accepted, and you sort of have to figure out how to come into yourself. And Hasina's done that work, and she almost feels like she'd make like a 5-step guide right now, right?
Yeah, I think it'd be a little bit more like 300 steps to like get there. It's very like a circular thing, right? You go one step forward and you go like 4 steps back, and then it's this like resilient factor that takes you forward.
Well, it's such an interesting thing because really, when we're talking about things around sexuality, sexual identity, or anything about who you are that is not normally accepted in society at large, and it's kind of like you're don't find a reflection of who you are out there and have to sort of carve out for yourself who you are in that community. It takes something. It takes lots of courage, takes resiliency. And I remember one point in our conversation, Hasina, we'll get a little more introduction for you in a second, but I remember you saying to me that, yeah, there was like a lot of, like sort of at university, there's all having all these associations that were for LGBTQ community, but you would never go to them. Yeah. Because you just didn't feel like it was necessarily your community. So I thought that's really interesting because it doesn't, like, there could be all kinds of resources out there in the world, but if the community that is your world and your community, your peeps and your people and your family, and if that world is created around you and it doesn't have access to who you are, that's when the suffering happens, right, Hasina?
And I think it's even more like, so I'm a Canadian-born individual. Like when I'm from Alberta, I went to school here and went to university and all that kind of stuff. So it's not as if I grew up in a vacuum. Like I listened to every other TV shows that other people watched. I listened to the same mainstream music that other people lived in. But I think I grew up at a time where homosexuality wasn't even legalized in Canada in the 80s and in the 90s. So there was that part about it wasn't represented in mainstream society. The same-sex marriage law that came into Canada was early 2000s, and it wasn't until the late 1990s that people even started coming out on television, right? People like Ellen who came out, and then that led to other people coming out and having it represented on TV. So even though I'm a Canadian-born person, grew up in Canadian society, my majority of my environment was my religious group. So it didn't even though I was born here and I started universities like 2000, it didn't even dawn on me that there was a pride center at the university that I went to. And I went to a pretty large institution. It didn't dawn on me that there were free counseling that I could have tapped into, or there were all these things, just because outside of school, I spent the majority of my time in my religious community. My values were partly meshed between my religious community and Canadian society. The majority of my friends were from my religious community. I spent like my sports community, my social community was all within there. And not to paint it in the context that everyone in the religious community that I grew up in was from the same background. It definitely depends on your individual context, as I'm sure there's other people who grew up in a similar setting, but we're a little bit more aware about, oh yeah, there is a pride center. There are people who are LGBTQ, but that wasn't necessarily my reality. So that kept me in the closet for a longer period of time. And it meant that I couldn't necessarily, if you ask me, when did I gain freedom in my life and like have this sense of, oh, I finally understand that I can thrive just like everyone else, I would say this year.
Yeah.
And that's 2019. at the age of 38.
Yeah.
Is quite delayed compared to if you grew up in a loving home and you happen to be heterosexual and you didn't have any other traumas in your life, then maybe you figured out freedom a lot sooner in life, right?
So paint for us the picture of what you grew up in, what was the environment you grew up in, and how you discovered that that you had interest in women.
So I think, as I said before, like I'm a Canadian born person who grew up in Alberta in a medium-sized city. The first 20 years of my life were figuring out how can I be Canadian while having family roots from Tanzania and India, and being born in a religion. The community that I grew up in the 80s and 90s didn't have a lot of people of color. So a question that I got asked frequently is, where are you from? By other Canadian born people. And that question always perplexed me because I thought, I'm just like you. So why are you even asking me that question to begin with? So a lot of the first 20 years of my life was figuring out, how do I mesh those identities together? And it wasn't until I graduated high school that I was able to blend those identities. And it's complicated because it's just not the identities, it's figuring out, how do you know which Canadian values to choose? And how do you know which religious values to choose? How do you communicate to your school friends that you can't go to that social event because you have a religious festival? And then you have to explain what that religious festival is, because the religion I grew up in is not part of the majority. It wasn't known to people. So how do you explain that? Can I have my school friends and my religious friends? Is that like a 50-50 split, or is it like a 70-30 split? How does that look like? And how do you belong when you're in junior high and high school, when those are critical years where you want to fit in, you want to be part of, you want to do things that everyone else is doing? And it wasn't until I went to university, and it was in my 4th year, and I would say there wasn't like a moment, it was just a realization that I'm not straight. But at that point, at the age of 24, I didn't have the language to define myself that, oh yeah, I'm a bisexual. It was just more, I'm not straight. And the people that I hang out with tend to be people from a religious community, and I don't know any of them that are not straight like me. I don't know anyone who's going through the same conflict of identity. So you look at the outer circle of, okay, maybe there's someone who's South Asian, who's Canadian, who's at your university, who's not straight, and who happens to be thriving in life. And I didn't see that. And when I went to university, this is like before Facebook and Twitter, the internet had just come out at the end of the 1990s. So it wasn't really represented in TV or media or newspaper, because the same-sex marriage law just came into effect in like early 2000s, right? So I didn't really see someone who was of color, who was LGBTQ, who happened to be Canadian born like me, who was thriving in LGBTQ. So I ended up being in the closet for 10 years until 2015, when my life was like coming to a crossroads and it was breaking down. And it was because I was holding this secret for so long, and all of my interactions with people were somewhat fake because I couldn't tell people. It's not like I wanted to tell people, oh yeah, I'm queer and this is who I am. But I couldn't have honest conversations to say, oh yeah, I'm going through a rough time. I couldn't say that to people.
Like you weren't able to talk about it.
So then that started the journey of like coming out to myself, and then coming out to others, and then starting this journey of, okay, you're out, but now you don't see the world from rose-colored glasses. So that started a process of sifting and sorting every community that I'm part of and every relationship. And I've lost a lot of community. I've gone through heartbreak. I've gone through feeling like the more I become myself, the more I lose people. And you sort of find a way to then balance it out. And there's a recognition that as an LGBTQ2 plus person, I will always struggle in life to a certain degree. I will always get prejudice. I will always have to sift my community and go into spaces and say, do I feel safe? Do I feel loved? And do I have an exit strategy? Am I going to be safe here with my partner? Am I going to be safe here in this environment? So unfortunately, it's just the context, and you kind of have more tools in your toolbox to sort of navigate those challenges as they come up.
Mhm. So I remember you sharing with me that the decision to share this with your family was a big process.
Mhm.
And it wasn't like, hey, parents, I'm going to just tell you this and run away.
Yeah.
There was a whole process. Can you give us like a sort of an experience of what that kind of process involved?
So in 2015, when I made the choice, I was at a crossroads where my life was really dark and I felt like the world was against me and nothing was working out. And I couldn't have any sort of like family relationship, friend relationship, or any kind of relationship just because I was holding on to this secret. So there was a recognition in me that A, I needed to do something that was drastically different. And B, I couldn't do it on my own. I didn't have the skills to do it on my own, nor the people that were closest to me, nor did they have the skills to support me as well. So I sought out professional help and I sent myself to counseling. And I went to the counselor and I said, listen, I want to come out to my family. Can you just give me the 3 steps and we'll just be good? And I'll do some reading at home. And in 3 weeks, I'll be good to go. Like that's the impression that I had. And it was at a time where I wasn't really connected with myself or connected to who my feelings or how to express my feelings. And my counselor said, listen, like, that's a good goal to have, but you need to learn how to feel your feelings because all you know is happiness, sadness, and anger. Because I came from a family where we didn't really talk openly about issues, and that was amplified in the community where it was all about fitting in. And there's a certain degree of people pleasing where if you see someone in your world is not, if you're not okay, you can express that in the privacy of your home, but you're not going to go then tell people outside because it's about image. It's about making yourself fit in and be this perfect person. So there's this whole process of going to counseling and learning how to, what are the feelings, learning that you can feel your feelings and it won't take you out. And then there was a process of coming out to myself and understanding that I had to, before others could accept me, I had to accept the shame and the guilt that I felt for being different, for not fitting in, for
So just to go a little bit deeper into that, like, why do you feel like it was so difficult for you to accept yourself? Like, what were the messages you had received that made it so difficult to love
because
yourself?
in my world, like the city that I live in, like there wasn't really open representation of LGBTQ2 plus people in my religious community because it's a pretty small community. The religious community is based in Canada,
Mhm.
across major cities in Canada, but the one that I'm in Edmonton, there's a smaller population. So when I went to the prayer center, it wasn't, I didn't see it represented. I didn't see it represented in my friend circle. I didn't see it represented within my family. And at that time, like I didn't, yeah, it was in mainstream. And by like, I came out in 2016, so it was in mainstream media and stuff like that. But in my world, it wasn't there. So I made that mean that, oh, it's not right.
But
It
was there
can't be good.
anything in the environment that made you feel like, no, I can't, or any messages you received, or was it just the fact there was no representation?
Well, I think there was no representation and there was no, no one was really talking about it in my world.
Mm.
Right? It wasn't talked about, it wasn't represented. So I thought, well, this can't be normal. Like, it must not be true, right? And there was no positive reinforcement to say, oh, you can be who you are and we'll accept you. Or there was no language around the LGBTQ community and inclusive language. There was none of that. So in my eyes, I was like, oh yeah, this is wrong. And this is going to get me disowned. And I'm going to lose my family and my friends and my religious community. And I'll be someone who's going to be all alone and just struggling through life.
Hmm. And did that turn out to be true, or how did that work out?
Well, because I came up to myself first and I sought help, I was in a more confident place to share the news with those that were close to me. So my family members were the first people that I shared. And the news was positively received to say that we don't know anything about this. We grew up in a country where LGBTQ was not even like a thing, like it could get you in jail, but we're willing to learn and we love you regardless of who you are. So
Hmm.
that definitely made the journey easier than had that first conversation been, oh, we disown you, then that creates a whole other spiral of trauma in it of itself. I would say from 2016, yeah, I've lost a lot of people. I've left my religious community that I was a part of for 34 years. I'm still grieving that process. It's like a bad relation. Like there's a lot of good things that happen and a lot of values and a lot of things that I'm grateful for in terms of opportunities, but to let go of something like that, that's been a part of your world that goes beyond just going to a prayer center, and it's a social community, it's a fabric, it's very hard. And there's been a lot of conversations where there's, if you're heterosexual, sometimes it's like you can be part of a religious community and be who you are. But in my case, there was always an or. Can I be who I am? And can I be who I am? Or can I be part of my religion? Can I be who I am? Or can I be with my extended family? Can I be who I am or be part of that social community? There's always an or there. And those ors are very challenging because it's shades of gray, right? It's shades of gray to know, do you fit in? And oftentimes there's also programming from the other side that it's not just the individual, but it's programming at the community level. There may be individuals within a community that are open, that are accepting, that are loving, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're at a community level. That's the same thing. And that's the disconnect, right? You need to have, in my opinion, it's nice to have both. You need to have individuals that are open, but it's also helpful that the community spaces that you're in are also affirming and have policies and have languages around that that show people that, yeah, we are inclusive, and then there's actions to match that. And if there's not, then people like, some people like me feel like there's a disconnect, and other people are like, no, I fit in. So there's a spectrum. So then it's like, as a community, you need to cater to the people who feel like they don't fit in. And then if there are those who fit in with existing policies, then that's fine. That's bonus, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting, that whole concept of like there's this community level, that there's like values that have
Yeah.
this umbrella around something. And when you look at your religious community, the belonging you had there, and maybe like extended family members, um, out of all that, like what was the biggest grief or loss for you?
I think it's the loss of the religious community, because that's where I felt like I belonged. That's where I felt like I felt understood. I celebrated things as a community. That's where I've grown up in. Like, I've grown up with a religion. I've grown up in the concept of group culture and praying individually, but then also praying in a large group and having that power and that influence, right? So that's definitely been a loss. And again, there's a spectrum in that, right? There's some people who are like, I'm part of that religion and I identify as LGBTQ, and I fit in and I belong and I feel loved and I feel supported. On the other side of the spectrum, there's people like me who are like, no, I don't feel like I belong. I feel like there's double standards in that religious community. There's an intention of being inclusive, but the actions aren't there. And so then, in my opinion, then if you're a religious community, then maybe there is a need to cater to all people across the spectrum. Because if you're catering to one, then you're leaving, if you're catering to one side of the spectrum, then you're leaving people behind. And to me, that's not okay if you're leaving me behind, or if I feel like I have to dim my light, or I feel like I don't belong just because I identify as different and there's no affirmative statement, there's no policies around inclusion, even though the faith in itself is based on a premise of a soul, and a soul is in and of itself genderless. So homosexuality should not be an issue, but there's no programming to correct that, to say, yeah, we actually, it's not an issue. There's been no formal language around that, right? So to me, silence is a response.
What was the most empowering part of your journey? Like what gave you the most power?
I would say two things: knowing how resilient I am to push through any sort of struggle and difficulty, because on this journey of figuring out who you are, it's the journey, in my opinion, it's not a 1, 2, 3 step process. It's every day you have to show up. So that's definitely a big thing. The second thing is tasting freedom. That's something that I tasted in 2016 for the first time when I came out. And since then, it's been growing. So for LGBTQ people, freedom is not something that we're born with. It's something that we have to consciously work for. And then just being secure in who I am as an individual and being able to communicate that and to stand in my truth, to say, this is how I believe in, and this is how I'm going to lead my life from the heart. has been very transformative in and of itself.
Like really choosing yourself.
Yeah. And that's not necessarily something that's, if I look at like South Asian culture, like there's very much a group element. So you want to operate like the group, you want to do things as the group. And the moment that you step outside of the group, there's a sense of that's not okay. You can be outside of the group in moderation, but don't go too far, because there's that element of wanting to fit in. So for me to step out and to say, I'm going to be myself, and I'm going to own my sexual energy, and I'm going to own my sexual orientation, is something that is huge, because we weren't really taught to be individuals within a group. We're taught to be part of the group and follow the norms and the behaviors and the belief systems of the group, not necessarily think on your own and do things from your heart. There's an element of like, you're part of a family structure, you want to make sure like that family structure is okay, you want to make sure you fit in your community level, and there needs to be a synergy, right? That's what you're sort of taught.
So here you are in the group. There's this kind of like consensus as the group. Like there's a feeling of community that you grew up with, and you are at a place where you're like, I can't continue like this. I can't. I have to individuate. I have to say who I am.
Yeah.
Like, what did that process of stepping out feel like?
It's basically a grief process that, if you imagine someone, the closest person to you, whoever that is, passing away, and the grief that you feel. And I believe in psychology, there's like the 5 stages of grief. That's totally what you feel. And it's not, I've been outside of my religion for 2 years now. I've gone through a lot of grief, and I've gone through the various stages, but do I still feel it? Yeah, of course I do. Will I feel it for a very long time? Yeah. Am I the happiest I've ever been? Yes. Are there things that religious festivals or things that trigger me when I see the community being rewarded on certain things, on diversity, but then seeing that people like me are being marginalized? Does that bother me? Yes. Do I feel like sometimes I question myself? I'm like, well, there's other people who have managed to reconcile their identity in terms of being LGBTQ and their religious community. So maybe I'm the one who's the crazy one who made the wrong decision. And it's this like conscious thing about, no, you made the decision that was right for you. And it doesn't mean that because you left the religious community, you're not a spiritual being, because there's various ways to connect to a higher power. Religion is one, going to yoga and doing it consciously is another one. You can do breathing meditations, like there's 1,001 ways, but for me to recognize that those are all equal has been a journey. And there's this, when you do let go of something that's so close to you, there's a sense of, you feel naked for a very long time, and there's this hole in your heart. And because a lot of people don't have the courage to do it, there's not a lot of people out there that can give you the how-to guide of like, oh, this is what generally happens. If you feel this, you will be like, it's okay. No, it's very much like people are questioning you, like, oh, like that's just a phase, right? Oh, but our community is inclusive. And I'm like, no, it's not. Or you're just gonna come back, right? Like you're just going through a little bit of a phase. So then you got to navigate all of these conversations on a daily basis, right?
So what does those different phases of grief look like?
I would say the first phase is loss. And there's a sense of questioning, did you make the right decision? There's a sense of betrayal, because there's a sense that the religious community was supposed to be there for you in your time of need, and why aren't you being acknowledged as a human being? There's anger when diversity is there to a certain degree, but it hasn't reached diversity of sexual orientation or diversity of gender identity or gender expression. So there's a sense of, well, it's 2019, like why aren't we there yet? And then there's a sense of like loneliness as well, to say, okay, well, now what do I do with my life? Because I've grown up in this sense of community, and all of a sudden it's not there. And then there's a sense of, okay, now what do you replace it with? But that's also not an easy process to be like, oh yeah, let me just go off the shelf and like try these 2 things and then figure out what's going to excite me.
Is born out of like ideas that are shared. Like there's a
Yeah.
study of like the scriptures, and then there's
Hmm.
practices like physical,
Yeah.
then there's the social aspect of like,
Yeah.
having suppers together and gatherings and celebrations and
Hmm.
festivals, and there's the whole sports element of like, having
Yeah.
fun and going out. And so there's these, it's like it was really, it was a very complete kind of experience, human experience.
Yeah. So it's figuring out all of those things, and it's not necessarily, it hasn't been graceful, I would say. I would say I'm resilient, that I've found certain things that excite me, and I've found certain community members, but it's definitely hard, and it breaks my heart that there are so many people out there that are like me, that struggle with identity crisis, and not many people are talking about it. And if you look at what's happening in society, in Canadian society, around the LGBTQ community, you look at what's happening in individual provinces, you look at, it's a struggle. Like if you boil down to it, it basically boils down to a conflict in values.
Yeah.
And it's an identity crisis. And until we get to that root of talking about values and talking about how you choose values, there will always be LGBTQ people who are victims of a system.
Hmm.
And that's not necessarily fair, because the trauma that I've gone through over the last, I would say I've gone through trauma for 30% of my life. It's based on values and programming, and it's not okay for
Mm-hmm.
people like this to suffer just because we're born differently and people are not ready to have courageous conversations. It's definitely telling.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking of that moment where you're deciding, okay, this is not working for anymore. And your mental health, as you said, kind of was collapsing in on
Mhm.
you. You're in your bedroom, and it's like that decision, like I have to like, do something about this. Can you describe a little bit of like what that crisis around mental health what looked like and felt like? Because it's like you had this community that you loved, and there's this thing that was like not being said, and it was clashing, and like you had to do something about this.
Yeah, so for me, I wouldn't necessarily say it was in my bedroom. I would say it was probably the religious leader who's, for simplicity's sake, I'll say, like, you have the Pope, and the Pope goes around to visit people, and it's a very like, it's a momentous occasion when the Pope goes actually to visit a community, and then there's some sort of like sermon that happens, and there's a whole bunch of people that come about, and it's an occasion that doesn't happen every day. It was similar to an occasion like that, and I was in a hall, and the religious leader walked in, and for a second I felt that connection and that sense of belonging, and after that I didn't. And to
Mm,
have that occasion was an historic occasion. Most people in that room felt a sense of connection, and a felt sense of gratitude, and a sense of belonging, and a sense of, oh my god, our religious leader is here, and like it's a momentous occasion, and I'm sitting in this hall and I feel a sense of disconnect.
where did that come from, that feeling of disconnect? Did something happen, or was it just
It
you
just
just
inside of me, it was inside, it's a feeling of like, yeah, there's a sense, because the thing is, as an LGBTQ person, when you come out, you become really connected with yourself and your intuition. It happens automatically. So the default is, when you're in spaces, you know intuitively that you feel like you belong and you feel safe. And if you don't belong and you don't feel safe, that will happen intuitively too, because coming out is all about developing a better connection with who you are. So when I sit into that hall that probably had like 10,000 people in it, and the religious leader comes in and he's like giving his sermon, and even when he's walking around to get to the stage, I'm like, I don't feel a connection. And
mm,
everyone else in this room feels a connection.
mm,
And it's that feeling of disconnect, and a feeling of like, yeah, this is not my jam anymore. And it's a feeling of like deep sense of like sadness and like heartbreak, that,
mm,
oh my god, like this truth that is now coming true. Like, I've known it since 2015. This incident happened in 2018. Like, the more I came out, the more I felt disconnected with my faith, and then it just solidified during at this one event, and I was like, oh.
mm.
And it's heartbreaking,
Yeah.
and there's no words to describe that level of like, when you know that you don't belong, but the community's been there for such a big part of your life, and then you're like, oh shit.
is it almost like the veils just fell
Yeah.
like an illusion, and
Yeah.
it's like it's not there anymore.
And that one is the most heartbreaking, because to do it in your bedroom is one thing, but when a religious leader's in the room and that's when you realize you don't belong, like how devastating.
Mm, yeah.
Same thing as going to see the Pope and you're like, oh shit, I'm not Catholic anymore. I can't do this.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So what did that look like? Like when you really felt like you had to do something about this because the
Mhm.
situation was so difficult. What was that? What did that look like?
So for me, it was just sharing it with my immediate family when we were sharing the experiences of how we felt. And that was a big conversation, because do I share it when everyone else probably had a positive experience? Do they
Mm,
really want to know? So that was part of it. And then it was taking stands to say, okay, I'm leaving and it's my decision. And that means, for me, it meant not going to the prayer center. For me, it meant not participating in social events, because in my eyes, the social events are only happening because there's a religious community.
mhm,
So it meant disconnecting from that and disconnecting from all of the religious celebrations, and just doing my own thing.
mhm,
That's
mhm,
like the simplified version, but it's a lot of like, it's not an easy process, and that's why you don't hear about a lot of people who do it, because you need a lot of courage and you need a lot of bravery and you need a lot of support around you to get through to the other side, because it's such a massive piece of who you are
mhm, mhm,
that you take it out and it's like a whole part of your body's been stripped out.
mhm. And how did you find love eventually? Like, how did that happen
Well, I
after
think
like, going through this process?
it was a conscious effort. Like I still had support, like professional support that I had. So it was tapping into that. It was continuing to do self-care. It was continuing to put myself out there in my advocacy work. It was about talking about it openly. And the more I talked about it, the more people came up to me and said, I share your struggle. I've had people as young as like 14-year-olds come up to me and say, I identify in a similar religion to you, and I'm LGBTQ and I'm Canadian born and I'm struggling. And you hear that validation and you're like, oh, I'm not the only one, but there's a sense of sadness. And the more you sort of take care of yourself, the more things get a little bit better. But there's no magic solution that I would say that, oh, yeah, like if you ask them, am I completely healed from it? And I would say, no. Am I still struggling to find community? Yes. Do I feel like sometimes I'm isolated? Yes. Is there days where I probably want to get out of bed and be with people? Yeah. Are there other days where I just want to isolate and be on my own? Most definitely. And it's just recognizing those and recognizing that I'm carving a trail on that no one's really on right now, but there will be a lot of people that will benefit from seeing me and seeing me own who I am, and take that as, oh, if she can do it and still be here and thriving and being happy, then I can do it too, regardless of what my context is.
Mhm. So eventually you found your way to tell your family and
Mhm.
got their support and they wanted to learn about it. There was a kind of sense of like your greater, the extended family becoming aware of it as well. You did this whole process. Um, and then it brought you to like the possibility of actually meeting someone and being able to be, visible with your partner.
Mhm.
How was that process finding that person that you were like, finally, I can like be out in the public with this person?
Well, I think that process was very much like you talk about, like the stars aligning, and we all hear about that story of like, write your list of things of the qualities that you want and put it out to the universe, and the universe shall return it to you. And in this case, my partner did the same thing. She wrote what she wanted on a piece of paper. I did the same thing. And we were both at points in our lives that were like, okay, we don't want to like play around with this. Like this has to be a life thing. So there was a very much an element of putting pen to paper and then letting the universe take care of it. And I know when I put it out there, I was like, I don't even want to go look for a person. Like just have the person sent to me and make it really obvious so you don't miss the signs, right? So that power of like manifestation that people talk about, it's definitely real because it resulted in me finding my partner, and my partner is someone who's my equal and has everything that I wanted in a partner and vice versa, right? So in that sense, it's been very much a thing of destiny.
And how has that worked with your family, like going back in your family with her?
I think people have been like relatively like open and accepting. We've had some challenges that have come about because of us being together, and there's been some safety issues that have come out that have sort of taken precedent over um, actually interacting and blending families and stuff like that. So I can't really answer that completely, but to say, yeah, it's happened to a certain degree and will continue to happen to greater levels. But at right now, we're focusing on safety issues for us that have arisen from people that aren't okay with us being together, which has put everything else on pause.
If you were to like summarize, or someone's just about to decide, make that decision of coming out, like what would be the steps you'd recommend them to go through?
I would say make sure you have a safety plan before you come out, because you don't know how your loved ones are going to react. They could react from loving you to disowning you. So having that support, that safety plan in place is critical. Make sure you have
Safety plan in terms of like having friends or like people to go to or things like that, or
yeah, like it's an all-inclusive. So like part of the safety plan is regardless of the reaction, who's there to support you? Is it a counselor? Is it a psychologist? Is it a combination? Is it a friend? Is it a family member? You need one person at least on that list that will help you regardless of the reaction from people. I would say in the situation of, because you go into these conversations and you don't know if you're going to be disowned or you're going to be accepted, you need to have a plan to say, if your loved ones disown you and you're living in their premise, for example, then where are you going to go? Are you going to go to a hotel? Are you going to go to your friend's house? Where are you going to live? How long are you going to live there for? How are you going to support yourself? Because not everyone has a rosy conversation. Most of the LGBTQ youth in Edmonton that are homeless because their parents didn't accept them. So that's part of the safety plan. And if you are going to get disowned, like, are there shelters? Are there other support services that you can get? How are you going to make sure that you can continue? If you're in school and you get disowned, well, are you going to go live with your relative and still be able to go to school? If you're working, like, can you go live with someone and still support yourself so you can go to work? Like, that's all part of the safety plan, and that needs to be there before you come out, unless you're in a situation where you know you're in a loving family and it's not going to be an issue, then you don't need a safety plan. But I would say the safety plan is the number one thing, and seek help from professionals to sort of help you through the emotions of knowing how to. The coming out process is very, it depends on each individual how they're going to do it, but professionals can guide you through the emotions and the anxiety, and can sort of guide you through the process of like what to expect and how to manage your emotions after, because it's just, life is not hunky-dory after you come out. There's a whole series of steps that need to happen after that.
Sort of like the steps of empowerment and things like that to keep on.
Yeah, so the main steps is like you come out, and then you need to sift and sort your community spaces and your relationships, and at the same time you'll be gaining more freedom. So in some senses there'll be conflicts around the way, because it's very rare that you have a smooth process. And then so you come out, you sift and sort your relationships, and there's going to be this thing about freedom and what that means to you, and how that's such a new feeling. So you kind of need to, if you need, I've needed support through that. I can't tell you what the steps are after, because I'm still on steps 2 and 3. So
right.
yeah.
Well, is there anything you'd love to say before we finish, that something that was really important to you in this process and that you'd like to put out there?
I would say, if you see people who are being marginalized because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity or gender expression, stand up. Don't think that someone else will do it for you. Someone else will
Oh, we're getting you cut out a little bit.
they're being marginalized in other ways, then have the courage to stand up.
Can you
And
just repeat that piece, because like you froze for a moment.
oh, I was just saying, for people who are heterosexuals and have privilege in community, and if you see people who are LGBTQ who are being bullied or who aren't being treated equally, then stand up for those people and don't have the mentality of someone else will do it. Because in order for the LGBTQ community to move forward, it's just not us that needs to stand up. We need the help of others. And for the people who identify as LGBTQ, be proud of who you are. Know you're not alone, and know that the struggles that you face are struggles that we face together. And the more you can seek out help and seek out community from others that are like you, the stronger that we will be. Because in the end, it's our diversity that makes us unique and makes society thrive.
What's the biggest piece that you learned about yourself in this whole process?
I'm very resilient throughout this process.
Just like your strength.
It's my inner strength and my motivation to do whatever it takes to be who I am in this world. And regardless of what's thrown at me, whether it's systems and structures, I will find a way to be myself.
Like you just came, what made you commit to that? Like what made you commit to the importance of that sovereignty in some way or form?
Because when I was down in the dumps in 2015, it was that, or just like go further in darkness. So it was from that moment where I felt like I couldn't be myself in any relationships, that I didn't have a relationship with myself. I felt like the world was against me, and the choice was do something drastic and commit to it fully, or just continue what you're doing and you will go in a downward spiral. So it was that moment that the choice was made, and it's been that firm commitment to say this is the only way to be. Because as I've gone through my milestones, it's like life does get better and you get more tools in the toolbox to sort of deal with challenges a little bit more effectively, rather than when I started, things would take me out for months, but that's not necessarily the case now.
And maybe like just to finish, like now that you have done that jump into owning yourself, like what's the biggest gift that you get at the other end of the other side?
A better relationship with myself.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hasina, for taking the time and sharing like such an intimate process and the struggles and the courage and the resilience you had to, like, you know, experience because of the situation that you were up against. So thank you for being who you are and being such an inspiration.
Thank you.
I know that your story in my book was like one of the stories that I just always felt like, wow, like this is so inspirational, because I think like Hasina's story can be applied for religion, but it can be applied for anything really when you don't feel accepted. And so it's just a powerful story. And I just was like so alive when I was writing that part of the book. I was like, oh my God.
And we see it in society. Like there's a sense of like, we're so disconnected and fragmented that the next wave of like society is how do you bring connection to people? And that connection is part of it is embracing people from different backgrounds and people who are different. And how do you bring people together when people are so fragmented in society? We see that at a country level, we see that at a province level, we see that in communities, we see that in families. And that's really the next test for us as like humans is how do we solve this?
Yeah. How do we step up and like build those bridges and understanding and getting in other people's worlds?
Yeah. And those conversations are tough conversations, but they need to be had. Otherwise, the alternative is just continuing this trajectory towards like being fragmented, which doesn't necessarily help people, right? Or help communities or countries.
Right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, you're awesome. I'm such a stand for you and for like who you are in the world. So thank you for being that resilient woman. Thank you.
Thank you. No problem. Okay.
Talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.